A national expert says pump the brakes on 2025 after last season's playoff debacle.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, the most watched Ole Miss podcast around. I am your host, Steven Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media and a former Ole Miss staff member. On today's show, Shehan Jeyarajah joins the show to talk about the national perspective on Ole Miss heading into the 2025 season. Trigger warning, there's an interesting disconnect right now. The computers love Ole Miss, but the pundits not so much. We dig into why that gap exists and what it says about the Rebels and how they are being perceived. We'll also dive into Austin Simmons and the pivotal role that he's expected to play this season. Later in the show, we'll discuss the direction of playoff reform and how it appears that the SEC is separating from the Big Ten in the latest models discussion. And finally, we ask the question, why does it seem more Danny Cannell style contrarians are propping up in college football media? Remember, we're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special hello to the insiders and everydayers who make the show what it is. Don't forget to check out a second listen on the network. Chris Gordy at Locked On SEC or Corey Burton at Locked On Vandy. They offer more perspectives on college football, the SEC, and yes, even potentially Ole Miss. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms and conditions apply. Let's get straight into the interview. Let's go. Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS national college football writer, a member of the FWAA, joins the show because basically, Shehan, Ole Miss is getting a lot of love internally. People that knows what's going on, kind of knows the players that are coming in. They're getting a lot of love from us. But I wanted a national perspective to see what the outsiders see from Ole Miss going into this season. What stands out to you? What should Ole Miss fans look for from a national perspective?
Well, I think that what's interesting about Ole Miss heading into 2025, I mean, it's obviously no secret that Lane Kiffin is the portal king. But, this was a unit last year, of course, that was so dominant in the trenches, and especially on the defensive line. And I think that some of I don't even want to call it skepticism, but some of the hesitation maybe from some national folks is wondering if they're going to be able to replicate players like Walter Nolan, like Princely Umanmielen, right? And then on top of that, you lose a first-round quarterback to the NFL as well in Jackson Dart. And, so I think that nationally we're a little bit more in wait-and-see mode. Now, look, wait-and-see mode with Lane Kiffin as your head coach and with the rosters he's able to put together, that's still a top 15 team in the country. I mean, it's still one that will be there in the playoff race at the end of the year. But, last year, I believe that Ole Miss started the season number 6 in the AP poll. I expect them to be a little bit closer to 15 to 20 just because of the amount of turnover that they had.
Which players are on your radar as a national writer for Ole Miss this season?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, obviously I'm very interested with that quarterback position. Obviously, Austin Simmons was a player who a lot of people wanted, ended up coming to Ole Miss. And I mean, I think it says a lot about the way that Ole Miss sees him that they really didn't bring any competition in for him. Obviously, of course, Trinidad Chambliss coming in as a backup, but not somebody who's supposed to compete with him for the starting job. So that's a huge endorsement to me. I love the addition of De'Zhaun Stribling coming over from Oklahoma State. To me, he was one of the best receivers in the Big 12 last year. And I think that in an offense like this, he has the opportunity to step into being really kind of a national name. Again, he didn't necessarily get that on a 3-9 Oklahoma State team last year, but I do think that he has the opportunity here. And by the way, they did replace an Umanmielen with another one, Princewell coming in. I'm very familiar with that family from their time down in Manor, Texas. That they are a really great family. Of course, Princely was a big-time player for Ole Miss, and Princewell boasts a lot of the same physical traits that you love from Princely. So I'm excited to see him kind of come in and have an opportunity to maybe have a bigger role.
Yeah, it should be interesting, and I'm excited about Austin Simmons, and I know that the Ole Miss fan base is really excited about what he can do because there's talk around Austin Simmons that this might be the most talented quarterback that Lane Kiffin has coached, not just been at Ole Miss under Lane Kiffin, just in his time. And if he has let's say a Tua-type impact, and because he wears number 13 and he's left-handed. I mean, we're going to go with the low-hanging fruit here. If he has that type of an impact, what do you think this offense can do?
Well, look, I mean, obviously Jackson Dart brought a lot to the table, and I think that he impressed people during his pre-draft process with his understanding of offense and all this sort of stuff. But there were limitations there, right? Like, I think that for me, like what Austin Simmons can bring to the table is a real gunslinger attitude. Is really somebody who can go downfield, challenge downfield, and I think that that's something that we haven't necessarily seen with consistency from Lane's offenses at Ole Miss because it's very structured. He does such a great job of putting his quarterbacks in good positions, but again, I think that when you start thinking about like the upside that a player that Austin Simmons has, and by the way, also with the receivers that Ole Miss has brought in and with who obviously the job that they've done developing receivers over the past couple of years, like there's a lot to be excited about. Now, the question is too, this is always going to be the question when you bring in a young quarterback is, are you willing to live with some of those growing pains? Do you deal with a 2 interception game in order to get that 3 touchdown game? I think that this might be the year where you're able to get away with that and where you're able to do that. But I mean, this is, I think, such a big opportunity for Simmons because again, like I mentioned it before, but it really is rare for a coaching staff to really not challenge their young quarterback and bring in somebody who can compete with him for the starting job. And so, if he's able to grow into what a lot of people think that he's going to be able to be, I mean, the future is really bright for him.
Yeah, and get ready for the storyline. The CBS is not an SEC partner anymore, but Austin Simmons has graduated from Ole Miss before his redshirt sophomore year.
It's crazy.
I'm sure that's going to come up. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Defensive side of the ball, the front seven, even though the front seven is kind of a misnomer because of the hybrid positions and all of that, but we'll just refer to it as run defense. Players like Jam Brown, who's not listed as a returning starter, but he was a freshman All-American, and William Echoles was a midseason freshman All-American. There's a lot of talent on the front of that defense, and this team, in my opinion, might be trending towards kind of a defensive unit at the start.
No, I think that's definitely true. And I think that you mentioned, of course, what they're going to be, especially as a run defense team. That was such a big part of what they did last year. But I think they're going to lean on that even more, especially with some of the turnover that they have in the secondary. Like, I think that they're going to try to keep the game in front of them in a lot of ways. They've obviously got a great player in Suntarine Perkins, who is such a big time player for this team, a leader. I think that he's going to be one of the best players in the entire country in 2025. And they also have just built depth over the course of years when you start talking about that defensive line. Again, they don't have I don't know that heading in they have the stars like they had last year, but sometimes it's not about having those 1 or 2, it's about having 4 or 5. And I think that Ole Miss is closer to having that this year. And again, one of the things that's most interesting as well is when you do transition over such a productive offense, like I'm curious if they do some things with pace to slow down the game, let their defense be in good positions as well, especially as they have a young quarterback who obviously is developing. But this is a team. I mean, I've been really impressed by what I've seen from Pete Golding. I think that he got a real bad rap at Alabama, and I think that he's proven himself in a big way at Ole Miss. And I think you're right. This could be a team that ultimately is defined more by its defense, especially in the first half of the season.
Hey, in your recent memory, can you remember a player like Suntarine Perkins who is roughly getting no preseason love going into the season? He's the defending leader in sacks and tackles for loss in the SEC, and yet nobody's talking about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to think back a little bit, I mean, obviously, like, he's a different type of player, but like, I mean, it reminds me a little of like the Will Anderson thing after maybe his freshman year, right? Where you just see some of these flashes where you see the different ways that they're able to use him. I'm pretty sure Pete Golding was his defensive coordinator at the time too, which probably is not a coincidence. But I mean, again, when you have a flexible player like that, it just changes the way that you're able to play defense, especially when you talk about playing in the SEC, because every defensive coordinator has to account for him. So, again, I agree. I think that he is one of the more overlooked players, especially on defense coming into the year. And I expect him to have a big year.
When we come back, we will talk to Shehan about the college football playoff. The SEC's catching bullets, but is it really all of their fault? We'll talk about that next. There's nothing like the NBA playoffs, the intensity, the buzzer beaters, the fans losing their mind. It's the kind of atmosphere you must experience live. And this year's matchups are already delivering, honestly. If you want in, Game Time makes it fast and easy to get seats, even for the biggest games. Prices on the app actually drop closer to tip-off, and with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees, Game Time is a total game changer. I was just on the app looking to see if Ole Miss had any tickets, if they were getting ready to do that, since they just sold out of the season tickets, or if there are any zone deals that offer like up to 60% off in different sections. I love that I can see my exact view before I buy on the app. No surprises. The app makes it ridiculously simple. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, we are back with Shehan Jeyarajah from CBS Sports and the FWAA. And obviously, we can't have a national person come on the show without talking about the future playoff. I know he probably hates talking about it at this point, but listen, going into SEC media, the spring meetings in Destin, which was covered by everybody, the week after the Big Ten spring meetings, which was covered by nobody, the SEC kind of got the rap that they're trying to push for these automatic qualifiers and all of this. And it turned out the SEC was a little bit more wishy-washy, at least publicly, than the Big Ten, because the Big Ten at this point seems all in on the 4-4-2-2-1-1. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I was a little surprised to see SEC people be a little more open than I expected to the non-auto bid model. Now, this has been true since, I've covered, some of the playoff dealings for, 4 or 5 years at this point. It's not rare that the Big Ten pushes something that the SEC has to answer for, because obviously those two groups are so intertwined. And, here's the reality of the situation too, right? I mean, Greg Sankey is willing to be a face of the sport. The Big Ten, Tony Petitti, some of the folks over in the Big Ten, like, that's just not how they operate. They're not people who are trying to be front and center with the media. And there are pros to that strategy and there are cons to that strategy. But one of the cons of it is, well, if you've got your partner, who, again, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be the main people deciding what happens in this playoff, and your more vocal partner kind of comes out from under you, that's how you find yourself in trouble. That's how you find yourself losing the plurality that maybe you had before. And so, I think it's interesting, right? For me personally, I mean, I hate the idea of 4 auto bids for 2 conferences, right? Like, I think that ultimately, to a certain extent, like, I feel like it leans on anti-competitive. The idea of finishing 4th place in your conference is more important than finishing as a top 16 team in college football. And I think the perspective from the SEC is we feel pretty confident we should be able to get at least 4 of the top 16 teams in the country every single year. You look back at last year, like, if there were 16, Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss potentially would have all been in the field. You might have been looking at 6 teams. The Big Ten, of course, I think that they're feeling a little less confident about their ability to year in and year out get 4 teams. Now, if I were the Big Ten, I think that I would feel pretty confident that I could get 4 on the merits by themselves with the brands that they have in that league right now. But here's the reality of the situation too, and this is true in both the SEC and the Big Ten. Like, the top teams don't really care, right? Like, Georgia doesn't care what model that we pick. Texas doesn't care. Ohio State doesn't care. It's really that second and third tier of teams, especially the ones who maybe are used to having a certain amount of historic success, that might not have that anymore, right? Like, I don't have inside info that this is one of the teams pushing for, but I think of a team like Iowa, right? That's been a Big Ten West champion year in and year out, and all of a sudden you're fighting actually to try to be a top 16 in the country year in and year out. And it's just a different kind of challenge than what you dealt with before. I think of, again, not inside info, but I think of a team like Oklahoma. They've been in the playoff every single year. And like, all of a sudden it's like, well, am I going to be able to get past all of Texas and Alabama and Georgia and LSU and Ole Miss and all these other teams versus, can I be one of the top 4 in the conference? That feels a lot more realistic for me, especially, by the way, when you look at a team like Oklahoma's schedule in 2025. So there's a lot of dynamics going into this. And the thing that I always urge people to remember is that none of these groups is a monolith, right? Like, what Rutgers wants is different than what Ohio State wants, is different than what Minnesota wants. And same in the SEC. And so, they're trying to get a consensus just the same way as anybody else. But I think the way that they've decided to be vocal about the 5+11 means that we're probably erring a little bit more in that direction.
Yeah, and it's a situation where the Big Ten and the SEC have to agree. Those are the only 2 conferences that have to agree on this. And if the Big Ten, like Ron Day, the coach at Ohio State, wants the 4 automatic qualifying bids, Ohio State they would be under no damage in a 5-11 model. That makes me think that he's kind of being the mouthpiece for the leadership of the Big Ten.
No, I think so too. And I think, look, like I mentioned, I mean, the SEC has been willing over the past 30 years, really, to be a vocal presence in the sport. And the Big Ten, for a variety of reasons, I think that they've wanted to hold themselves up reputationally in some ways, all sorts of things. Like, they have just not been willing to play this public media game. And I think the reality is, when you have 2 conferences like that have so much power, like, you're ultimately going to have to speak. Like I think that Tony Petitti is ultimately going to have to go on the record with some of this stuff. Because here's the other side of the equation as well. No other conference, whether the other 2 power conferences or any of the Group of 5 conferences, none of the other conferences wants a 4-4-2-2-1-1-1. It's just right now publicly the Big Ten. And while I don't think that the SEC alone is enough to push us off of that path, if it's the SEC and everybody else versus just the Big Ten, that becomes a whole lot harder of an equation.
Definitely. And all of the extra stuff, I will be completely honest with you. I'm kind of a fan of the 4-4-2-2-1-1 because I like the regionality of college sports. And whenever everything becomes playoff centric, you lose that portion of it. And big games, it'd be a kind of a good way to do things for the fans of the SEC and the Big Ten. I do realize that the Big 12 and the ACC, they would feel differently about that. But my question would be, somebody like Texas Tech, it was rumored the other day that they're going to spend somewhere around $55 million this year on athletics. Texas Tech is obviously trying to get the Big Ten and the SEC's attention.
Well, and I think that, and actually I'm heading out to Lubbock next week to ask some questions as well. So that should be a lot of fun. But I think that they understand, like, there is this moment in college athletics right now, especially before the House case officially goes, into play, where, like, this is our moment. We can pay our top basketball player $4 million. It doesn't matter, right? If we've got the money, we can just pay it. Obviously with the transfer portal, right? I mean, they add the pitcher from Stanford who takes them all the way to the Women's College World Series final. They add the number 2 transfer class in the entire country. So, like, I think that there's a couple pieces of this, right? Like, one, I mean, the reality is, when to go to a Big 12 and ACC discussion for a second, like the difference between the Big 12 and the ACC is that the ACC has national title contenders and the Big 12 doesn't. But the Big 12 has a lot more motivated teams than the ACC does, right? I mean, you really kind of tap out at that 3 to 4. And like you said, I think that a lot of these teams are trying to get the attention of the top of college football and say, hey, we have the ability to compete, because not only does that impact things in the short term, it also impacts your perception as a brand in the long term, whether that is as a potential target for one of these two leagues, or whether it's, hey, you know what, when it's time to go back to the negotiating table for a television contract or for a CFP contract, you got to take us into mind a little bit more than you did before.
And when we come back, I do want to talk to Shehan about the SEC. Normally, you're used to the hate from usual sources, Danny Kanell, all of that stuff. But now it feels like there's more that's just kind of wishing the league would fail for no reason. And we kind of look at what can happen with the SEC on that. So stick around. All right, Shehan, listen, we're used to Danny Kanell going against the SEC on every time they lose a game, he's going to tweet. It's going to happen. He's built a brand on that. But lately, it seems like, especially during the last college football playoff, there was an avalanche of reporters waiting to join in. The downfall of the SEC is happening. And I don't think that's the case. I just think the team that was the most talented in the SEC did not make the college football playoff, and that would be the Ole Miss Rebels. But why are these people so gleefully trying to basically be Danny Kanell?
Well, I think that there's a couple pieces of this, right? One, like we talked about, the SEC is the conference that's willing to be the most vocal and obviously try to use perception to their advantage. And that served them well, right? I mean, they won all these national championships in the past 20 years. And college football might be the sport where most perception is reality. Because if you perceive a team to be a national title contender, recruits are going to go there and potentially make them into a national championship contender. So that's one piece of it. Two, I think that people are starting to see, I don't want to even go as far as saying collapse, but like cracks in the foundation, right? I mean, the last 2 years, for the first time in 20 years, the SEC did not have a team playing in the national championship game. The last two champions were both from the Big Ten. And look, I mean, our media atmosphere is so fascinating, right? Because you mentioned it earlier, like this is a regional sport, and you have people, a lot of powerful voices historically have come from the SEC. And especially when the Big Ten wasn't close to winning titles, there's really not a whole lot they can say back. And for the first time, I mean, again, it had been since 2014 since the Big Ten had won any title. And then, Ohio State was the only one to win one in the BCS and playoff era, dating back to 1998, until Michigan did it in 2023. I think that they're starting to take some of their first victory laps as part of it, because it's been so long since they've had the opportunity to do so. The other thing too, though, and, I think that this gets into a really interesting conversation is, I think that the reign of, Nick Saban retired, of course, back a couple years ago. And I think that the reign of unmatched terror is probably over in college football in the SEC. Now, the SEC is going to have more national title contenders than anybody. If you ask me, in the next 10 years, I think the SEC will win more national titles than anybody. But there was a monopoly for a while there, right? Where you're talking about Alabama, LSU, Georgia, like all these teams. And even, by the way, the teams that were not SEC teams, most of them were still from the South. When you talk about Clemson and Florida State and Texas, I think that in some ways, this is a natural pushback to that run of dominance, to where, hey, you know what? We got a team up in Ohio who's able to compete. We got a team in Michigan, we got a team in Oregon, right? We'll see if more teams geographically can step up to that challenge as well. But I think that this is a great rivalry to have for college football, is, again, some of these Big Ten teams, some of these West Coast teams, some of these East Coast teams suddenly rising to the attention and being willing to throw around with the best.
Yeah, and if the 4-4-2-2-1-1 model gets going, they're talking about a Big Ten SEC challenge to where every SEC team would play a Big Ten team and kind of monetize that rivalry, because let's just be real about it. Everybody talks about Alabama and Auburn and all the stuff, the brother versus brother. The SEC versus the Big Ten school, there's the reason that bowl season is successful in any way are those Florida bowls. Everybody was paying attention to the Citrus Bowl or the I guess it's the ReliaQuest Bowl now. Those SEC versus Big Ten games and what they meant.
No, 100%. And look, again, when you talk about like recruiting historically, I mean, in the modern era, like the SEC has dominated it. And as a result, I think that perception has really moved to the side of the SEC for good reason. I mean, again, I mentioned all the success that the league has had. I think that per se, everybody else, I mean, the Big Ten at the forefront, but everybody else, they want their crack, right? Like, just as an example, I'm a Baylor graduate and I live in the state of Texas, and like Baylor plays Auburn week 1. And that's going to be a really hyped game, not just for those two teams, but for the Big 12, for people outside of the Southeast to kind of say, hey, you know what? This is a team that is projected as a top 15 to 20 team. So we get our shot at it, right? And like, I think, people frame it as the idea of like, well, this is this team's Super Bowl or whatever. But like, there are only a few opportunities that non-SEC teams get to swing at SEC teams. And, again, the SEC is kings of college football for the entire 21st century. And I think that everybody's kind of now like, hey, I want my shot too.
Yeah, I feel bad actually for Auburn having to be the first SEC team to go into because that environment in McLean Stadium is going to be a cauldron. It's going to be, and Hugh Freeze has a history of losing non-conference games. He does, but I could see Dave Aranda, who coached at LSU. I've seen what he can do defensively. I can see Baylor giving them more than they want to have. I actually would probably think Baylor is going to win that game, honestly.
No, I think it's going to be a really good one. It's a Friday night game, so I should be able to get down to it. So that'll be a lot of fun. But again, there are these measuring sticks that every school, I think, has. And like, again, the SEC has been at the top of the charts for such a long time that I think that, when you get an opportunity to try to compete, and this has been true, I think, for much longer than just these past couple of years. The only difference is that, at least with the Big Ten, they're very slowly starting to win a few of them.
Yeah, and it's good for college football. In the age of the transfer portal, NIL, and all the equalizers that are out there, of course, you're not going to be able to stockpile players at Alabama, at Georgia, as we saw in the round 2015-ish. So tell everybody where to read your stuff and what you got going on, buddy.
Yeah, you can find all my work over at cbssports.com. You can follow me on any social media platform at Shehan Jeyarajah. And we got a whole lot of stuff. You mentioned that I might not want to talk about playoff. I'm glad we didn't have to talk about lawsuits, but we got a whole lot of information about the new House v. NCAA settlement over at cbssports.com. So make sure and check that all out.
Yes, absolutely. Check that out. And thank you very much for coming on the show. We'll talk to you later, buddy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your go-to source for Ole Miss sports. We pride ourselves in offering the most comprehensive perspectives, which is why we're the front door of Ole Miss. Anytime anybody is looking for any questions about Ole Miss, they usually come here first. Your support means the world to us as well. For your second listen, check out the Portal Show. Brian Smith has the latest rumors, portal entries, and signings. Be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to college football's landscape. Find the Portal on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Hotty toddy, everyone. And remember, analytics is just the old English word that means bad football. We'll see you tomorrow.